On the morning of September 14, 2020, the technology world woke up to headlines that seemed almost too audacious to be real. Nvidia, the California-based GPU giant whose chips power everything from high-end gaming rigs to the world's fastest supercomputers, had agreed to buy ARM holdings from Japan's SoftBank for a staggering $40 billion. In a single move, the deal promised to fuse the crown jewel of mobile processor design with the undisputed leader in graphics and AI acceleration. Industry analysts immediately called it the most important semiconductor transaction in history, a game-changer that could redefine computing for the next decade. The stakes were enormous. ARM's designs sat quietly inside 95% of the world's smartphones, embedded in billions of IoT devices, and increasingly eyed by data center architects looking to break the dominance of x86. Nvidia, riding high on the AI wave, envisioned combining its graphics expertise with ARM's energy-efficient CPU architecture to create a unified platform for everything from autonomous cars to hyperscale cloud servers. On paper, it was a vision of synergy and innovation, but behind the glossy investor decks and smiling press photos, a darker question began to ripple through the industry. Was this truly about innovation or about locking up the future of computing in the hands of a single player? Within hours of the announcement, Qualcomm's leadership began expressing unease, hinting that ARM's long-held neutral licensing model could be jeopardized if it were owned by a direct competitor. In London, murmurs spread through Parliament about the strategic importance of ARM as a national asset, while in Brussels, competition lawyers quietly pulled past case files on semiconductor mergers. In Washington, officials at the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice started informal calls with industry stakeholders. The deal's sheer scale and potential to reshape supply chains made it impossible to ignore. The press conference that followed was a masterclass in corporate optimism. Nvidia's charismatic CEO, Jensen Huang, framed the acquisition as an investment in the UK and a commitment to ARM's independence. SoftBank's Masayoshi Son beamed at the camera, touting the deal as proof of his vision fund's foresight. But even as the words innovation, partnership, and growth echoed through the live stream, there was a palpable sense of countdown, a quiet recognition that the world's most powerful regulators were about to put this deal under the microscope. Somewhere in the background, deal lawyers were already calculating the drop-dead date and the penalties if regulatory approval didn't come through. Lobbyists were drafting talking points. Competitors were preparing dossiers of objections, and the public, still digesting the headline number, $40 million, was about to witness a global tug-of-war over the future of the chip industry. The clock had started ticking, and every second brought the companies closer to a decision that could either cement a new era of semiconductor dominance or kill the most ambitious tech deal of the decade before it ever closed. Nvidia's story began in 1993 in Santa Clara, California, when three engineers, Jensen Huang, Chris Malachowski, and Curtis Priam, decided the future of computing lay in accelerating graphics. Starting with niche products for PC gaming, Nvidia's break came in 1999 with the GeForce 256, marketed as the world's first GPU. Through the 2000s, they dominated the gaming graphics market, expanded into professional visualization with the Quadro line, and began experimenting with parallel computing for scientific applications. By the 2010s, Nvidia had successfully repositioned itself as a leader in artificial intelligence hardware, supplying GPUs that trained the deep learning models powering everything from self-driving cars to medical research. By 2020, its market capitalization exceeded $300 billion, and its influence reached far beyond gaming. It had become a cornerstone
of the AI revolution. ARM Holdings' path was very different. Founded in 1990 in Cambridge, UK, as a joint venture between Acorn Computers, Apple, and VLSI Technology, ARM specialized in designing ultra-efficient CPU architectures. Rather than manufacturing chips itself, ARM licensed its designs to other companies, from smartphone giants like Apple and Samsung to microcontroller makers serving the automotive and industrial markets. This neutral licensing model allowed ARM's technology to become ubiquitous. By 2020, more than 180 billion ARM-based chips had been shipped worldwide. Its low-power designs made it the undisputed standard in mobile devices, and its reach was expanding into servers, networking equipment, and emerging IoT ecosystems. The two companies operated in complementary worlds. Nvidia excelled at high-performance, energy-hungry GPUs that crunched massive workloads, while ARM was the master of frugal, efficient CPUs that sipped power. By the late 2010s, the semiconductor landscape was shifting. Mobile computing had matured, cloud computing was exploding, and AI workloads were becoming mainstream. The demand for heterogeneous computing, systems combining CPUs, GPUs, and specialized accelerators, was surging. Both companies saw the convergence coming. There were pressures too. For Nvidia, growth in the PC gaming sector was slowing, and data center expansion was capital-intensive. For ARM, SoftBank's 2016 acquisition had saddled it with expectations for aggressive revenue growth, but its licensing model generated steady, not explosive, returns. At the same time, geopolitical tensions over chip supply chains, especially between the US and China, were reshaping the competitive landscape. It was in this climate, with the semiconductor industry at the heart of global economic and political strategies, that the idea of merging Nvidia's raw compute power with ARM's architecture neutrality gained traction. In theory, the combination could create a single platform spanning edge devices to cloud supercomputers. In practice, it meant one private company could control both the blueprints for the world's most widely used CPUs and the most advanced GPUs, concentrating unprecedented influence in a single set of hands. The question was not just whether such a union could be achieved, but whether it should. And as 2020 unfolded, the timing seemed, for better or worse, perfect. SoftBank wanted to cash out. Nvidia wanted to cement its position as the backbone of the AI era. Regulators, though, were about to decide whether this was visionary strategy or dangerous overreach.
By the time Nvidia announced its intent to acquire ARM in September 2020, the semiconductor market was a vast and intricate web of interdependencies, and the numbers told a story regulators could not ignore. Nvidia controlled roughly 80% of the discrete GPU market for PCs and over 95% of the data center GPU market, according to John Peety Research. In AI-specific workloads, its dominance was even more pronounced. Nearly every major AI training cluster in the world ran on Nvidia hardware. ARM, on the other hand, commanded more than 90% of the mobile CPU architecture market, with designs found in nearly every smartphone sold globally. If measured in terms of chip units shipped, ARM's reach was staggering. More than 25 billion ARM-based chips were shipped in 2020 alone. The Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, HHI, a standard measure of market concentration, painted an even sharper picture. In mobile CPUs, the HHI was already above 3,000, a level considered highly concentrated by U.S. antitrust standards, with ARM's architectural dominance dwarfing any rival ISA instruction set architecture, such as x86 or RISC-V. The geographical breakdown reinforced ARM's strategic significance. Its largest licensees spanned continents: Apple and Qualcomm in the US, Samsung in South Korea, Huawei in China, and MediaTek in Taiwan. Nvidia's GPU customers were similarly global, but heavily concentrated in North America and Asia. Together, these two firms had deep influence over critical segments of the tech supply chain, from smartphone processors and automotive controllers to cloud AI accelerators powering Google, Amazon, and Microsoft data centers. Barriers to entry in these markets were towering. Designing a competitive CPU or GPU architecture from scratch required billions in R&D, years of development, and access to advanced fabrication nodes that only a handful of companies like TSMC and Samsung could provide. Switching costs for customers were immense. Software ecosystems, tool chains, and developer expertise were tightly bound to specific architectures. There were also precedents. Regulators remembered Intel's antitrust troubles in the early 2000s over x86 dominance, Qualcomm's licensing battles with the FTC and EU, and blocked semiconductor deals like Qualcomm NXP in 2018, which collapsed under Chinese regulatory pressure. These cases had established a pattern. When one company controlled both critical intellectual property and a significant manufacturing or performance edge, antitrust authorities tended to act aggressively. For regulators, the raw numbers suggested a risk of vertical foreclosure, where Nvidia, as a competitor in several of ARM's licensee markets, might have both the incentive and the ability to disadvantage rivals by altering licensing terms, delaying access to new designs, or integrating proprietary features unavailable to others. Even without direct price manipulation, subtle shifts in technical roadmaps could tilt entire markets. It was clear from the outset, the statistical profile of this deal set off alarms. While Nvidia touted complementary strengths, the combined market power was unlike anything the semiconductor industry had seen before. In Brussels, London, Washington, and Beijing, the data alone was enough to justify a closer look, and those closer looks were about to become full-scale investigations.
From Nvidia's perspective, the logic of acquiring ARM was compelling, even irresistible. In the company's official investor presentation, CEO Jensen Huang framed the deal as a once-in-a-generation opportunity to unite the AI leader with the most ubiquitous computing platform. Nvidia's slides painted a vision of seamless synergy, ARM's energy-efficient CPU architectures powering everything from smartphones to edge devices, combined with Nvidia's unmatched GPU acceleration in AI, graphics, and high-performance computing. Together, they could create a platform spanning cloud to edge to IoT, dominating workloads across the technology spectrum. The synergy pitch had three main pillars. First, technology convergence, the belief that future computing would not be CPU-centric or GPU-centric, but a tightly integrated blend of both, along with AI-specific accelerators. Second, market expansion. ARM's licensee network gave Nvidia an instant foothold in markets it had struggled to penetrate, such as mobile devices and embedded systems. Third, R&D acceleration, pooling engineering resources to speed up innovation cycles and deliver new architectures faster than any competitor could hope to match. To investors, Nvidia promised cost efficiencies, broader product reach, and a revenue model diversified beyond its traditional GPU sales. On the September 2020 earnings call, Huang repeatedly emphasized the complementary nature of the two businesses, insisting that ARM's neutral licensing model would remain intact. The message was carefully crafted. This was not about restricting access, but about injecting capital and expertise into ARM's roadmap, benefiting all licensees. Yet regulators and rivals saw a different subtext. Synergies in M&A are often double-edged. The same integration that speeds innovation can also create choke points. Critics argued that Nvidia's control of ARM's IP could subtly or overtly tilt the playing field. For example, Nvidia could prioritize features that worked best with its own GPUs, or delay compatibility with rival products. Even if such actions never happened, the mere possibility could distort competition, discouraging rivals from investing in ARM-based solutions. There was also the geopolitical angle. Owning ARM would give Nvidia, and by extension a US-based entity, significant control over a key part of the global semiconductor ecosystem, a sensitive issue for licensees in China, where ARM's technology was foundational. This raised questions about potential US export controls or technology restrictions, especially given the escalating US-China tech rivalry in 2020-2021. The heart of the debate boiled down to two competing narratives. Nvidia's version was one of collaboration and empowerment, where the combined entity would accelerate the future of computing. The opposing narrative was one of control and gatekeeping, where ARM's open ecosystem could gradually bend to serve Nvidia's strategic goals. Huang closed the pitch with a bold promise. The deal would create the premier computing company for the age of AI and deliver unprecedented benefits to consumers and developers alike. Whether that promise would outweigh the perceived risks was a question that regulators across 4 continents were now preparing to answer.
The agreement, announced on September 13, 2020, outlined one of the largest semiconductor transactions in history, a $40 billion acquisition structured as a mix of cash and stock. Nvidia would pay SoftBank $21.5 billion in Nvidia shares and $12 billion in cash, including $2 billion paid up front at signing. An additional $5 billion in potential earn-out payments was tied to specific performance targets, plus $1.5 billion in equity grants to ARM employees to retain talent through the transition. The structure reflected both ambition and caution. By using a large stock component, Nvidia aligned SoftBank's interests with the long-term success of the merged entity while conserving cash. The deal terms also contained a detailed set of pre-closing covenants requiring both companies to operate independently and preserve ARM's licensing neutrality until approvals were secured. The public timeline was aggressive for a transaction of this magnitude. Nvidia and SoftBank projected an 18-month closing window, targeting completion by March 2022. The formal regulatory filings would start within weeks, first in the United States with the Federal Trade Commission, then in the United Kingdom with the Competition and Markets Authority, in the European Union with the European Commission, and in China with the State Administration for Market Regulation, SAMR. Each jurisdiction's review would be critical. Failure in even one could collapse the deal. Behind closed doors, deal lawyers penciled in the so-called drop-dead date, the contractual point after which either party could walk away if approvals hadn't been secured. This was set for September 2022, giving some buffer beyond the public target. A breakup fee clause required Nvidia to pay SoftBank up to $1.25 billion if regulatory failure scuttled the acquisition, a signal of both the high stakes and the confidence Nvidia projected. The contract also included exclusivity provisions. SoftBank could not solicit or negotiate with other buyers while the deal was pending. More telling was the rumored inclusion of a hell or high water clause in certain jurisdictions, obligating Nvidia to take all necessary steps, even structural remedies, to win approval. This was unusual for a deal involving such broad regulatory exposure and hinted at the seriousness with which Nvidia pursued ARM. In the weeks following the signing, teams on both sides began preparing voluminous filings for antitrust authorities, mapping out the competitive landscape in exhaustive detail. At the same time, communication strategists refined talking points for investors, governments, and the press. They knew that once the filings became public, the battle for perception
would be as important as the legal arguments. By October 2020, the countdown was officially underway. A high-value, high-risk deal had been set in motion, and every milestone, from the first regulator meeting to the last shareholder briefing, would now carry outsized weight. The question looming over it all was whether the timeline Nvidia envisioned would hold, or whether mounting opposition would drag the process past its breaking point.
The market's initial response to the announcement was electric, but split along predictable lines. Nvidia's stock surged nearly 6% in the days following the reveal, adding billions to its market capitalization as investors imagined a future where the company's dominance in AI would be bolstered by control over the most widely licensed CPU architecture in the world. SoftBank's shares in Tokyo jumped as well, reflecting relief that the Japanese conglomerate had found a high-profile, deep-pocketed buyer for one of its most prized and some argued underperforming assets. But beyond the trading floor, the mood was far less unanimous. Within hours of the press release, analysts from Bernstein, Jefferies, and UBS began issuing cautious notes. They acknowledged the strategic logic, but warned that regulatory headwinds are not just probable, they are inevitable. In the semiconductor industry, large vertical deals had already drawn scrutiny, and this one combined two companies with enormous influence over complementary and sometimes overlapping markets. The loudest early criticisms came from competitors. Qualcomm executives quietly briefed journalists, hinting that ARM's neutrality was a linchpin of the tech ecosystem and could not be preserved under the ownership of a direct rival. Intel, though publicly restrained, was rumored to be monitoring the situation closely. Smaller ARM licensees, companies whose business models depended on predictable access to ARM's technology, worried privately about potential changes in licensing terms, pricing, or access timelines. Industry associations began to weigh in. In the UK, the trade union Unite called for a full government review, citing the risk of ARM's headquarters and decision-making being moved out of Cambridge. In the US, consumer advocacy groups began drafting statements urging the FTC to investigate whether the acquisition could stifle innovation in mobile and IoT markets. The media seized on the drama. The Financial Times ran a front-page feature describing the deal as a bet on the future of computing that could reshape global tech power. Reuters quoted unnamed EU officials who predicted a long and complex review. In China, state-affiliated outlets voiced concern that a US-controlled ARM could face export restrictions affecting Chinese companies. Public opinion, at least among those paying attention, was polarized. Some saw Nvidia as a visionary company capable of accelerating ARM's growth and ensuring it stayed at the forefront of design innovation. Others saw a potential choke point forming in the semiconductor supply chain, one that, if abused, could tilt the balance of power in critical markets for decades. What became clear in those first weeks was that the battle lines were already forming. Investors, regulators, competitors, and customers were all beginning to take sides. The enthusiasm of Wall Street was matched by the skepticism of policymakers, and the gap between those perspectives would only widen as the deal advanced into formal scrutiny.
As the initial excitement faded into the grind of regulatory preparation, the real scope of the stakeholder map came into focus, and it was vast. On one side were the direct market participants, ARM's licensees, ranging from tech behemoths like Apple, Qualcomm, and Samsung to hundreds of smaller semiconductor firms whose designs relied on ARM's cores. These companies had built entire product lines, software stacks, and customer commitments on the assumption that ARM's licensing would remain neutral, predictable, and universally accessible. For them, Nvidia's ownership introduced uncertainty that could reverberate through multi-year development cycles.
On the consumer side, most end users would never know what instruction set architecture their devices used, yet their experience depended on the competitive dynamics in the chip market. Advocacy groups, like Public Knowledge in the US and Which in the UK, began to voice concerns in op-eds and letters to regulators, warning that reduced competition in upstream chip design could lead to higher costs, slower innovation, and fewer choices in consumer electronics, from smartphones to smart appliances. Suppliers and manufacturing partners also had skin in the game. Foundries like TSMC and Samsung, who fabricated both Nvidia's GPUs and ARM licensees' CPUs, faced the possibility of demand shifts if Nvidia began steering ARM's roadmap to favor certain integration strategies. Component suppliers in the broader semiconductor supply chain, from memory vendors to packaging houses, quietly modeled scenarios where a vertically integrated Nvidia ARM might capture disproportionate market share in emerging sectors like automotive AI systems and edge computing devices. Even software developers became an indirect but important constituency. ARM's instruction set was embedded in countless tool chains, compilers, and operating systems, from Android to embedded Linux distributions. Any change in licensing terms, access speed, or architecture direction could ripple into the software ecosystem, requiring costly adjustments for developers and companies alike. Then, there were the less visible but equally influential actors, government agencies concerned with national security. In the UK, ARM was regarded as a strategic asset, integral to the country's role in the global tech industry. In the US, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, CFIUS, had a history of reviewing semiconductor deals for security implications. In China, where ARM's technology was deeply embedded in domestic chipmakers' products, state regulators viewed the transaction through the lens of geopolitical rivalry. Real-world caselets began surfacing in regulatory submissions and press reports to illustrate the stakes. A small IoT device maker in Germany worried that if Nvidia prioritized certain GPU-CPU combinations, their cost-efficient ARM-based design would lose support. An automotive startup in Japan feared that proprietary Nvidia ARM integrations could lock them out of next-generation autonomous vehicle platforms. These stories personalized the broader antitrust theories, giving them weight beyond abstract market share graphs. As these voices accumulated, a pattern emerged. The deal was not just a transaction between two companies, it was a potential restructuring of the semiconductor industry's power map. And that made almost every participant in the global tech supply chain, from a smartphone OEM in Shenzhen to a chip designer in Austin, an indirect stakeholder in the outcome.
By late 2020, the Nvidia ARM transaction was no longer just a headline-grabbing business deal. It was firmly embedded in the workflows of the world's most powerful competition authorities. In the United States, the Federal Trade Commission, FTC, took the lead, initiating its pre-merger review under the Hart-Scott-Rodino Act. The early signs pointed toward an intensive process. Industry sources leaked that the FTC had issued a second request for documents, a step reserved for transactions with potentially significant competitive concerns. This meant Nvidia would have to produce tens of thousands of internal emails, strategy decks, and financial models for analysis. Across the Atlantic, the UK's Competition and Markets Authority, CMA, began its own investigation in January 2021, invoking not only competition law, but also national security provisions under the Enterprise Act. ARM was a homegrown champion, and political pressure to scrutinize the sale to a US-based company was intense. By August 2021, the CMA had moved into a Phase 2 investigation, citing potential harm to competition in global markets and to innovation in semiconductors. Brussels, the European Commission, acting under the EU merger regulation, opened a formal probe in October 2021. Executive Vice President Margrethe Vestager stated plainly that the Commission was concerned Nvidia could restrict or degrade access to ARM's technology for competitors, which might lead to reduced innovation in the next generation of chips. The investigation was set to run at least 90 working days, with the possibility of extensions. Meanwhile, in Beijing, China's State Administration for Market Regulation, SAMR, took a slower, more opaque approach. Given the geopolitical climate, Chinese regulators were acutely aware that a US-controlled ARM could be subject to export controls, limiting Chinese firms' access to critical IP. Although China was not ARM's largest revenue source, its licensees, including Huawei's chip design arm, HiSilicon, were strategically important. The legal frameworks varied by jurisdiction, but the theories of harm overlapped. Regulators were examining whether Nvidia's acquisition would enable vertical foreclosure, reduce ARM's incentive to license its architecture on fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory terms, and give Nvidia unfair insight into competitors' product plans via ARM's licensing relationships. The potential consequences ranged from blocking the deal outright to imposing remedies so onerous that Nvidia might walk away. The procedural roadmap was now public knowledge. Statements of objections, market tests, and hearings would follow in sequence, with each regulator independently assessing whether the merger passed muster under their statutes. For Nvidia and SoftBank, the realization was unavoidable. The global nature of ARM's licensing network meant this deal needed a clean sweep of approvals. Failure in even one jurisdiction would be enough to collapse the transaction. By the close of 2021, the regulatory gauntlet was fully in place. The countdown that began in September 2020 now ticked not toward an early close, but toward a legal confrontation in multiple capitals, each with the power to decide the fate of the most ambitious semiconductor merger in history.
As the regulatory dragnet tightened, Nvidia and SoftBank shifted into a parallel campaign that was less about legal arguments and more about shaping perception. The acquisition was no longer simply a matter for lawyers and economists. It was also a battle for hearts and minds, in boardrooms, in the press, and behind closed doors with policymakers. Nvidia's lobbying apparatus went into overdrive. In Washington, it retained heavyweight law firms and policy consultants with deep antitrust experience, including former FTC and DOJ officials. The company's official filings and talking points emphasized themes carefully calibrated for each audience. For U.S. policymakers, the message was that a stronger Nvidia ARM would help America compete with China in the race for next-generation semiconductors. In the UK, it promised to maintain ARM's Cambridge headquarters, expand local R&D, and hire more engineers. In Brussels, it framed the deal as a way to accelerate European innovation in AI and energy-efficient computing. SoftBank, still the seller but deeply invested in the deal's success, echoed these points through its own political networks. Masayoshi Son personally reached out to key figures in Japan and the UK, portraying the transaction as a partnership between two leaders that would preserve ARM's neutrality while giving it the scale to thrive. Public relations was equally orchestrated. Nvidia commissioned advertorials in tech and business publications, highlighting case studies where Nvidia GPUs and ARM CPUs already work together in innovative products, suggesting the merger was merely a natural extension of existing cooperation. Company executives gave high-profile interviews to outlets like the Financial Times and CNBC, leaning into the narrative that ARM's licensees would benefit from increased investment and faster product roadmaps. There were grassroots elements too, though some bore the hallmarks of astroturfing, the practice of manufacturing the appearance of public support. Opinion pieces appeared in regional newspapers praising the economic benefits of Nvidia's promised UK investment. Industry groups with historical ties to Nvidia began issuing statements of support. But these efforts sometimes backfired. Investigative reporters pointed out connections between supposed independent voices and Nvidia's lobbying partners, undermining the authenticity of the campaign. The opposition was just as active. Qualcomm, Google, and Microsoft quietly coordinated their own messaging through industry coalitions, ensuring regulators received a steady flow of technical arguments against the deal. Consumer advocacy organizations amplified these concerns, framing them not as corporate rivalry, but as threats to innovation and choice. By early 2022, the information war was fully underway. Every public comment period became a proxy battlefield, every press leak a potential lever to sway regulatory sentiment. Nvidia's strategy hinged on presenting the deal as pro-innovation, pro-competition, and geopolitically advantageous. Opponents aimed to brand it as a monopolistic power grab. In the end, both sides knew the verdict would be shaped as much by these narratives as by the cold statistical evidence on market concentration.
The first public confrontation over the Nvidia ARM deal unfolded in a hybrid setting, part in-person, part video conference, as pandemic-era protocols still lingered in early 2022. The venue, a modern hearing room at the UK Competition and Markets Authority's London offices, was configured for maximum transparency. Cameras streamed the proceedings to a secure feed for accredited journalists and stakeholders. The atmosphere was tense but controlled, the kind of quiet in which every shuffle of papers and click of a pen seemed amplified. Representing Nvidia, CEO Jensen Huang sat alongside the company's general counsel and a lead antitrust attorney from one of London's most respected law firms. Across from them, ARM's executives, still formally independent under SoftBank, occupied a separate table. The CMA panel consisted of senior case officers, economists, and a chair with decades of competition law experience. Observers from the European Commission and US FTC joined remotely, underscoring how closely coordinated this review had become across jurisdictions. The opening remarks from the CMA chair were measured but pointed. The panel intended to explore whether the transaction would substantially lessen competition in markets for CPU design, GPU integration, and emerging AI accelerators. They would also examine national security and innovation impacts. This set the stage for hours of probing exchanges. Huang's prepared testimony leaned heavily on the synergy narrative. He spoke of unlocking innovation and uniting two complementary companies to meet the challenges of the AI era. Slide decks projected behind him illustrated examples of Nvidia ARM collaborations already in the market, from automotive systems to cloud-based AI services. He reiterated commitments to maintain ARM's open licensing model, even offering to put certain assurances in writing as binding behavioral remedies. But when the questioning began, the tone shifted. CMA economists pressed Nvidia on its incentives post-acquisition. Wouldn't a rational profit-maximizing strategy involve steering ARM's development toward features optimized for Nvidia GPUs, potentially disadvantaging competitors? An exchange over an internal email produced under the second request became a flashpoint. The email, from a senior Nvidia product manager, speculated about preferential integration opportunities with ARM's next CPU architecture. Huang countered that the comment was informal brainstorming and not reflective of corporate policy, but the moment hung in the air. Opposition voices were given time as well. A Qualcomm vice president, speaking remotely, warned that the deal would upend decades of trust in ARM's neutrality. A representative from a European cloud provider raised concerns about vertical foreclosure in AI hardware supply chains. These interventions, though brief, added weight to the theoretical harms regulators had outlined. Key exhibits, technical roadmaps, licensing term sheets, and excerpts from market analysis were displayed selectively, each side choosing visuals that reinforced its narrative. The regulators' questions grew increasingly granular, probing not just the potential for anti-competitive conduct, but the difficulty of detecting and policing it once the deal closed. By the time the hearing adjourned for the day, no knockout blow had been delivered, but the dynamics were clear. Nvidia was walking a fine line between offering enough concessions to satisfy regulators and avoiding commitments so restrictive they would undermine the deal's strategic value. For the CMA and its counterparts, the hearing confirmed that this was no routine merger review. It was a battle over the governance of a foundational layer of global computing.
By the time regulators in the UK, EU, US, and China had gathered months of testimony, documents, and market analysis, the opposition's narrative had crystallized into a clear, data-driven case. At its core were the classic theories of harm that competition authorities apply to vertical mergers, but here they were magnified by the centrality of semiconductors to the global economy. First was the threat to ARM's neutrality. For decades, ARM's licensing model allowed it to supply CPU architectures to hundreds of companies, including direct competitors in overlapping markets. Regulators argued that once ARM became part of Nvidia, that neutrality would be compromised. Even without overt discrimination, Nvidia could subtly tilt ARM's design roadmap to favor its own GPUs and system-on-chip integrations. The mere perception of bias, they noted, could push licensees to seek alternatives, destabilizing markets. Second was the risk of vertical foreclosure. Regulators cited Nvidia's dominant share of the high-performance GPU market, above 80% in data center AI accelerators, and ARM's near total dominance in mobile and embedded CPU architectures. Combined, they would have the ability to shape both ends of a heterogeneous computing stack. This could manifest in delayed access to new ARM cores for Nvidia's GPU rivals, or in bundling practices that made Nvidia ARM solutions cheaper or more performant than mixed vendor alternatives. Third was the data advantage. As ARM's owner, Nvidia would gain access to confidential information about licensees' product plans, technical specifications, and long-term strategies. Regulators argued that this informational foreclosure could give Nvidia an unfair edge in anticipating and countering competitors' moves. In markets where design cycles span years and billions in investment, such intelligence could be decisive. Evidence supported these concerns. Internal ARM and Nvidia communications, disclosed under subpoena, included discussions about synergistic alignment of product roadmaps and leveraging architectural leadership in joint offerings. One ARM engineer, in an email to a colleague, expressed unease that integration with Nvidia could create implicit pressure to prioritize features beneficial to Nvidia's ecosystem. While Nvidia characterized these as speculative or informal, regulators saw them as indicators of potential incentive shifts post-acquisition. Precedent cases were also invoked. The European Commission referenced the 2018 Qualcomm NXP deal, where fears of technology foreclosure played a central role in the transaction's collapse. The FTC cited its successful challenge of Cisco US Foods in 2015, arguing that promises of operational efficiency could not outweigh structural risks to competition. The final strand of the case was innovation harm. Regulators warned that Nvidia ARM integration could chill the incentive for non-Nvidia players to invest in ARM-based innovation,
knowing their roadmap might be shaped or strategically delayed by a competitor. In fast-moving fields like AI and edge computing, even small lags could determine market leadership. When presented in hearings and filings, the case against the merger was not framed as anti-Nvidia sentiment. Rather, it was positioned as a defense of the semiconductor ecosystem's structural openness. The underlying message from the CMA, FTC, and EC was blunt. Once such a concentration of control existed, no set of behavioral promises could fully unwind its effects.
Nvidia's defense of the ARM acquisition was meticulously constructed to counter each pillar of the regulatory case. In formal submissions and public hearings, its executives framed the deal not as a power grab, but as a strategic alliance between two complementary innovators whose combined capabilities could accelerate the next era of computing. At the heart of the argument was verifiable efficiencies. Nvidia stressed that ARM lacked the scale and resources to fully capitalize on emerging opportunities in AI, cloud computing, and advanced edge devices. By joining forces, Nvidia claimed it could inject billions into ARM's R&D budget, hiring more engineers, expanding into new design domains, and shortening development cycles. The benefits, they argued, were merger-specific. ARM could not achieve them alone, nor could Nvidia without ARM's CPU architecture expertise. On the neutrality question, Nvidia offered a series of binding commitments. These included maintaining ARM's open licensing model, preserving equal access to all licensees, and even instituting Chinese wall protections to prevent sharing of sensitive licensee information between ARM and Nvidia's competitive business units. In the UK and EU, Nvidia floated the idea of creating an independent compliance board to monitor adherence to these commitments, reporting directly to regulators. Nvidia also highlighted consumer benefits. By combining ARM's CPUs with Nvidia's GPUs, the merged entity could deliver more power-efficient AI accelerators, reduce latency in cloud-to-edge computing, and bring advanced capabilities to cost-sensitive devices like smartphones and IoT sensors. These advances, Nvidia claimed, would be passed through to consumers in the form of better performance per watt, longer battery life, and more affordable high-performance computing solutions. The company pushed back on the foreclosure theory by pointing to market realities. ARM's architecture, they argued, already competed with alternatives like RSV, which was gaining traction in both academic and commercial settings. Moreover, Nvidia stressed that harming ARM's licensees would undermine the very licensing revenue stream that justified the acquisition, a self-defeating strategy for a profit-driven company. To address concerns about informational advantages, Nvidia proposed structural safeguards, strict separation of licensee data, independent decision-making within ARM's engineering teams, and contractual non-discrimination clauses enforceable in court. Executives noted that Nvidia itself was a major ARM licensee before the deal and had coexisted with ARM's other partners without issue. In rebutting the innovation harm argument, Nvidia reframed the merger as an innovation catalyst. They presented case studies where Nvidia's AI expertise could enhance ARM-based designs, autonomous vehicle platforms with integrated vision and decision-making chips, low-power AI inference processors for medical devices, and hybrid cloud architectures optimized for AI training and inference at scale. Each example was paired with projected timelines and performance metrics, aiming to prove that these products could only be realized with combined resources. The underlying tone of Nvidia's case was that regulators risked blocking progress by overestimating hypothetical harms and underestimating tangible benefits.
Jensen Huang, in a closing statement to EU officials, encapsulated the company's position. "We are not here to close doors, we are here to open them faster, wider, and for more people than either of us could alone."
The turning point in the regulatory battle came when investigators uncovered a set of internal communications that, while not explosive in the tabloid sense, carried the weight of strategic intent. Among thousands of pages of discovery, regulators in both the FTC and the European Commission zeroed in on an internal Nvidia presentation from mid-2020, prepared before the deal was publicly announced, outlining integration opportunities with ARM's architecture. One slide in particular drew attention. It described a roadmap for deep architectural alignment between upcoming ARM CPU cores and Nvidia's proprietary GPU interconnect technology. The language was cautious but telling. The integration would optimize cross-platform performance for Nvidia ecosystems and differentiate against other heterogeneous compute vendors. Regulators read this as tacit acknowledgement that Nvidia could, post-acquisition, tune ARM's designs to work best with Nvidia products, a scenario that matched the foreclosure concerns they had been warning about for months. In another email thread, a senior Nvidia engineer responded to a colleague's query about maintaining ARM's neutrality with a line that regulators would later quote in hearings. "We can honor the letter of the licensing model while still steering the ship." Nvidia's legal team argued the comment was speculative, made in an informal context, and did not reflect corporate policy. Still, in the careful parsing of antitrust scrutiny, the phrase "steering the ship" became shorthand for potential subtle influence over ARM's trajectory. There were other pieces. A confidential market forecast, produced by ARM's strategy team for SoftBank in early 2020, projected that integrating tightly with a major GPU vendor could shift market share in data center CPUs by up to 15% within 5 years, almost entirely at the expense of x86 incumbents and smaller ARM licensees. While the document did not name Nvidia, its timing and assumptions matched Nvidia's strategic ambitions. A whistleblower added further texture. A former ARM product manager in a confidential interview with European regulators claimed there had been off-the-record discussions with Nvidia engineers about deprioritizing certain features heavily used by ARM licensees who were also Nvidia's GPU rivals. Though uncorroborated, the testimony reinforced the plausibility of the theories of harm. When these exhibits surfaced in hearings, the reaction in the room was immediate. Regulators leaned forward, counsel shifted in their seats, and reporters scribbled notes. For opponents of the deal, it was the closest thing to a smoking gun, not outright proof of future misconduct, but credible evidence that Nvidia's incentives could align with the very anti-competitive outcomes it denied would happen. In public, Nvidia doubled down on its commitments, dismissing the documents as cherry-picked and taken out of context. But inside the regulatory chambers, the balance was beginning to tip. What had once been a debate over hypothetical risks now had a paper trail suggesting those risks were not just theoretical, they were, at a minimum, contemplated.
As the evidence piled up, Nvidia's legal and strategy teams moved into a new phase of damage control, crafting remedies that might persuade regulators to clear the deal. The proposals had to thread a narrow needle, strong enough to alleviate fears of anti-competitive conduct, but not so onerous that they gutted the strategic rationale for acquiring ARM in the first place. The first category on the table was behavioral remedies. Nvidia offered binding commitments to maintain ARM's open licensing model for at least a decade, enforceable through regular compliance audits by an independent monitor. These commitments included equal access to all new ARM CPU cores, non-discriminatory pricing, and a formal firewall between ARM's licensing operations and Nvidia's product teams. The company even floated the idea of a licensing ombudsman, an independent figure appointed jointly by Nvidia and regulators to hear complaints from ARM licensees. Then came structural remedies, which were far more contentious. Some regulators suggested partial divestitures, for example, spinning off ARM's IoT services group or certain proprietary IP blocks to ensure continued independent development. Nvidia resisted, arguing that slicing up ARM's business would destroy the very synergies that justified the $40 billion price tag. The European Commission reportedly explored the possibility of a hold separate arrangement, in which ARM's core licensing business would remain operationally independent under separate management. Another proposal centered on access commitments. Nvidia promised that all ARM licensees, regardless of competitive alignment, would receive new architecture releases at the same time Nvidia's own product teams did, with legally binding penalties for violations. The CMA, however, questioned the enforceability of such provisions over a multi-year horizon, particularly in a fast-moving sector where minor delays could shift market dynamics. A more radical suggestion came from the FTC during informal talks. Nvidia could complete the acquisition, but immediately relist ARM as a separately traded public company, retaining only a minority stake. This, they argued, would give Nvidia influence without direct control, preserving market trust in ARM's neutrality. For Nvidia, this defeated the purpose. The goal was to integrate ARM's technology deeply into its own roadmap. SoftBank, for its part, supported Nvidia's offers of behavioral remedies, but pushed back hard on structural concessions. Any significant divestiture or minority stake arrangement would slash the deal's valuation, undermining SoftBank's financial objectives. Behind the scenes, the seller's interests and the buyer's strategic ambitions were perfectly aligned and perfectly at odds with what regulators seemed to require. By early 2022, it was becoming clear that no remedy package was likely to satisfy all four key jurisdictions: the US, UK, EU, and China simultaneously. Even if one accepted the proposed behavioral commitments, another questioned their enforceability. And in high-stakes mergers, inconsistent global approvals are enough to doom the transaction. The remedies were on the table, but so was the unspoken reality. The deal's survival odds were shrinking, and the decision point was approaching faster than Nvidia or SoftBank had hoped.
The decisive blow came on February 7, 2022, after nearly 18 months of filings, hearings, and increasingly pessimistic private briefings. Nvidia and SoftBank issued a joint statement. The $40 billion acquisition of ARM was terminated. Officially, the collapse was framed as a mutual decision in light of significant regulatory challenges that made it impossible to close the transaction within a reasonable time frame. Behind the diplomatic language, the picture was starker. In the United States, the FTC had already filed an administrative complaint in December 2021 seeking to block the deal outright, alleging it would give Nvidia the means and incentive to stifle innovative next-generation technologies. The UK CMA, deep into its Phase 2 investigation, had signaled it was unlikely to approve without structural remedies Nvidia refused to consider. The European Commission had paused its formal review clock to demand additional information, and China's SAMR had shown no signs of moving toward clearance, a silence many interpreted as quiet opposition amid tense US-China tech relations. Faced with a regulatory wall in 4 major jurisdictions, Nvidia's legal team concluded that continuing would mean years of litigation and uncertainty with no guarantee of success. For SoftBank, time was money. The longer ARM remained in limbo, the longer it was unable to pursue an IPO or strategic partnerships that could capitalize on booming semiconductor demand. In the joint press release, Jensen Huang struck an optimistic tone, calling ARM a great company with incredible talent
and praising the work done during the merger planning process. Masayoshi Son pivoted quickly, announcing that SoftBank would prepare to take ARM public within the fiscal year. But market watchers noted the sharp contrast between the ambitious, confident language of September 2020 and the cautious, face-saving phrasing of February 2022. The immediate reactions told their own story. Nvidia's shares dipped slightly but recovered quickly. Investors had already priced in the growing likelihood of failure. SoftBank stock rose on speculation that an ARM IPO in a hot semiconductor market could fetch a valuation exceeding what Nvidia had agreed to pay. Regulators, for their part, touted the collapse as a victory for competitive markets. FTC Bureau of Competition Director Holly Vidova issued a brief statement underscoring that the proposed vertical deal would have distorted incentives in key technology markets. In many ways, the decision was less a sudden death than the end of a slow, public unwinding. The deal had been battered for months by legal headwinds, political sensitivities, and the sheer complexity of satisfying multiple regulators with overlapping but not identical concerns. When the termination finally came, it felt inevitable, the formal acknowledgement of a reality that insiders had recognized for weeks. Still, the collapse carried weight beyond the two companies involved. It was the largest tech deal to be abandoned under global regulatory pressure since Qualcomm's failed $44 billion bid for NXP in 2018, and it sent a clear signal to the semiconductor industry. In an era of heightened antitrust vigilance, even the most visionary mergers could be stopped cold.
The aftermath of the collapsed Nvidia ARM deal rippled through financial markets, boardrooms, and R&D labs almost immediately. For Nvidia, the termination meant writing off nearly $1.36 billion in breakup fees and transaction-related expenses, a costly reminder that even well-funded giants could be humbled by regulatory realities. The company's leadership moved quickly to reassure investors that its growth trajectory in AI, data centers, and gaming remained intact. On the next earnings call, Jensen Huang struck a pragmatic note, emphasizing that Nvidia had learned a great deal from the process and would continue collaborating with ARM as a licensee. Still, the lost opportunity was significant. Nvidia's long-term strategic vision of tightly coupling ARM CPU architectures with its GPU and AI platforms would now have to be pursued through looser partnerships rather than full integration. Internally, engineering teams that had spent over a year mapping joint product roadmaps were forced to pivot, reassigning resources to projects that didn't rely on proprietary access to ARM's technology. For SoftBank, the fallout was a mixture of relief and urgency. The deal's collapse removed a cloud of uncertainty that had stalled ARM's independent plans, but it also put immense pressure on SoftBank to deliver value through the promised IPO. Preparations began in earnest for a public listing on either the London Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, or potentially a dual listing, a process complicated by volatile market conditions and questions about ARM's valuation without Nvidia's integration story. In Cambridge, ARM's employees experienced whiplash. Many had been promised retention bonuses tied to the merger, and while some incentives remained, others vanished with the deal. Morale was mixed, relief among those worried about losing independence, disappointment among those excited by Nvidia's promised investment. ARM's leadership scrambled to present a forward-looking vision to keep top engineers from being poached by rivals in the hyper-competitive semiconductor talent market. The competitive landscape adjusted quickly. Rivals like Qualcomm, Intel, and Samsung saw the deal's collapse as a reprieve, freeing them from the looming possibility of negotiating technology access with a direct competitor in GPUs. Startups in the RISC-V ecosystem seized the moment, pitching their open-source alternative as the truly neutral path forward in processor architecture. Financial analysts took a longer view. The failed acquisition, they argued, was more than a corporate setback. It was a cautionary tale for any cross-border tech merger in the age of aggressive antitrust enforcement. The breakup demonstrated that the combination of global regulatory scrutiny, geopolitical tension, and concentrated market power could kill even the most financially compelling deals. Within Nvidia, the board reviewed its M&A strategy, questioning whether future transformative acquisitions could survive the same gauntlet. For SoftBank, the clock was ticking on monetizing ARM before the semiconductor cycle cooled. For the industry, the immediate fallout wasn't just about two companies walking away from a signature, it was about recalibrating expectations for what was possible in big-ticket semiconductor consolidation.
The collapse of the Nvidia ARM deal sent shockwaves through the semiconductor industry, not only for what it prevented, but for the precedent it reinforced. Competitors who had spent 18 months gaming out survival strategies under a merged Nvidia ARM now found themselves in a reprieve, but one that came with a new understanding. The regulatory climate had shifted, and large-scale consolidation in critical tech sectors would face unprecedented scrutiny. For ARM's licensees, the end of the deal restored a sense of strategic stability. Qualcomm, Samsung, Apple, and MediaTek could return to roadmap planning without the specter of a GPU market leader shaping the CPU architecture their devices depended on. Several companies moved quickly to deepen their own ARM-based design investments, confident that ARM's neutral licensing stance would remain intact, at least in the near term. The RISC-V movement emerged as one of the most unexpected beneficiaries. As news of the deal's collapse spread, startups and established chipmakers exploring RISC-V architectures ramped up marketing campaigns, portraying the open-source ISA as the safer, geopolitically unencumbered alternative to ARM. Investment flowed into RISC-V initiatives from both venture capital firms and national governments eager to reduce dependency on any single private IP owner. For Nvidia, the absence of ARM forced a recalibration of its ambitions in CPUs. Rather than owning the architecture, the company doubled down on its Grace CPU project based on ARM's Neoverse designs as a way to compete in data center and AI workloads without controlling the underlying IP. The pivot underscored an industry truth. Integration could be achieved through partnership and in-house innovation even if M&A was off the table. SoftBank's ARM, meanwhile, found itself in an unusual position, freed from the merger's limbo, but thrust into a spotlight of heightened expectations. Preparing for an IPO, ARM sought to demonstrate growth beyond its historical licensing revenues, targeting data centers, automotive, and IoT markets as high-growth verticals. The collapse had the paradoxical effect of making ARM both more independent and more pressured to perform. The broader industry took note of the geopolitical subtext. Regulators in the US, UK, EU, and China had aligned, albeit for different reasons, in opposing the transaction, a rare display of cross-border consensus in an era of fractured trade relations. For multinational tech companies, the message was unmistakable. Global regulatory coordination could now sink deals that, a decade earlier, might have sailed through. In the wake of the deal's demise, some analysts argued that the semiconductor sector had entered a post-mega-merger phase where strategic alliances, joint ventures, and licensing partnerships would replace outright acquisitions as the preferred means of expansion. Others cautioned that the industry's cyclical nature meant consolidation pressures would return, but with greater emphasis on political feasibility from day one. The ripples were not just about competitive positioning, they reshaped the psychological landscape of the sector.
The Nvidia ARM collapse became shorthand in boardrooms for a new reality. In the chip industry's most sensitive domains, the question was no longer whether a deal made business sense, but whether it could survive the gauntlet of a world where antitrust and national security concerns had become inseparable.
When the Nvidia ARM acquisition unraveled, it didn't just mark the failure of a single high-profile deal. It established a precedent that would be studied, cited, and invoked in boardrooms and regulatory offices for years to come. Antitrust authorities across multiple continents had, in effect, drawn a red line in the semiconductor industry. Even vertical mergers between companies in complementary markets could be blocked if they threatened the structural openness of critical technology ecosystems. In the United States, the FTC's December 2021 complaint became a reference point for how to frame theories of harm in vertical integration cases. The language was notable. It treated access to intellectual property as a competitive bottleneck on par with control over physical production. This approach signaled to other industries, cloud computing, telecom, biotech, that controlling a dominant technology platform, even without directly competing in all downstream markets, could trigger aggressive enforcement. The UK's CMA went further by explicitly invoking national security considerations alongside competition law. ARM was deemed a strategic asset, whose transfer to a foreign owner required extraordinary justification. That blend of industrial policy and antitrust enforcement offered a template for other jurisdictions seeking to protect domestic technology champions, and it hinted at a future where M&A reviews would routinely mix economic and geopolitical assessments. In Brussels, the European Commission used the case to reinforce its position that behavioral remedies, promises to act a certain way after a merger, are often insufficient in technology markets. Officials referenced the Nvidia ARM experience in later speeches as proof that structural risks demand structural solutions, such as divestitures or outright prohibitions. This stance would influence future reviews of tech sector deals, from cloud infrastructure acquisitions to AI-driven platform mergers. China's SAMR, while less public in its reasoning, demonstrated the leverage of silent delay. By neither approving nor outright rejecting the deal, it effectively joined the global blockade without escalating into a public confrontation. For multinational companies, the message was clear: regulatory approval in China could not be taken for granted, especially when US-China tech tensions were in play. The cumulative effect of these coordinated actions was a shift in the M&A playbook. Legal advisors began warning clients to assess political feasibility as rigorously as financial and operational synergies. Global clearance risk became a front-end calculation, not a post-announcement contingency. Beyond process, the Nvidia ARM collapse reinforced a policy narrative gaining traction worldwide, that preserving innovation in fast-moving tech sectors requires not just punishing monopolistic behavior after it occurs, but preventing market structures that create the potential for it. In that sense, the case became a rallying point for a more preventative, less reactive approach to competition policy. In industry circles, the term ARM precedent started to circulate, shorthand for the idea that if a deal consolidates too much control over foundational technology, no amount of public relations spin or promises of neutrality will be enough to get it through. For regulators, it was a success story. For dealmakers, it was a warning shot. And for the global tech sector, it was a sign that the age of easy mega mergers was over.
In the post-mortem analyses that followed the collapse of the Nvidia ARM deal, executives, lawyers, and policymakers sifted through the sequence of events for lessons that might shape the next generation of high-stakes mergers. Three themes emerged with particular clarity. The first was timing and sequencing. Nvidia announced the deal in September 2020, at the height of geopolitical tensions over semiconductor supply chains and amid a wave of antitrust activism targeting big tech. In retrospect, the macro environment was almost perfectly hostile to a cross-border transaction involving a strategic technology asset. A more cautious strategy might have involved building a multi-year partnership with ARM, demonstrating neutrality in practice, and pursuing an acquisition only after a sustained track record of collaborative trust with licensees and regulators alike. The second was narrative discipline. Early in the process, Nvidia's messaging was ambitious but occasionally inconsistent. While Jensen Huang repeatedly promised to preserve ARM's open licensing model, some leaked internal communications hinted at strategic integration advantages. In a hyper-scrutinized regulatory climate, even a single off-message document can become an anchor on the credibility of public commitments. The lesson for future dealmakers: align all internal and external narratives from day one, recognizing that every email and slide deck could one day be an exhibit in a hearing. The third was remedy design realism. Nvidia's initial remedy offers were heavily behavioral, promises to act in certain ways, rather than structural. This clashed with the growing skepticism among regulators that behavioral remedies can be enforced effectively in fast-moving tech markets. A more viable strategy might have involved identifying preemptive structural concessions, such as partial spin-offs or independent governance models, that could have eased regulatory fears without undermining the strategic core of the deal. The case also underscored the importance of anticipating global clearance risk. In a world where a single major jurisdiction can derail a multinational transaction, companies must not only map out the antitrust laws of each relevant country, but also understand the political and national security context that shapes enforcement. The alignment of the FTC, CMA, European Commission, and, through inaction, China's SAMR showed that opposition can be multi-front and mutually reinforcing. Finally, there was a cultural lesson. Mergers of this magnitude require sustained, high-level engagement with all stakeholders, from customers and suppliers to political leaders and advocacy groups. Nvidia invested heavily in lobbying and public relations, but opponents were equally adept at framing the debate in terms that resonated with regulators' core mandates. The ability to control the narrative, anticipate counterarguments, and adapt messaging as new evidence surfaces may determine whether a deal survives the gauntlet. For corporate strategists, the Nvidia ARM saga became a case study in both ambition and overreach, a reminder that in the current regulatory era, the most brilliant technological logic can be undone by the complex interplay of law, politics, and perception. The enduring takeaway: the road to transformative M&A is now as much about diplomacy and foresight as it is about balance sheets and synergies.
When the dust settled, the Nvidia ARM saga left more questions than answers about the future of the semiconductor industry. The collapse of the deal had preserved ARM's independence, at least for the moment, but it also underscored the fragility of that position in a market defined by scale, capital intensity, and geopolitical competition. With SoftBank pushing ahead toward an IPO, the question lingered: could ARM thrive without the deep pockets and integrated ecosystem that Nvidia had promised? Or would it eventually find itself back in the crosshairs of another suitor? For Nvidia, the path forward was equally uncertain. The company had proven it could drive industry-defining innovation without ARM in its portfolio, yet the strategic logic that drove the attempted acquisition, controlling a foundational layer of computing architecture, hadn't disappeared. Would Nvidia try again with a different target, or double down on organic CPU development like the Grace project? And if it did return to the M&A arena, could it navigate the regulatory terrain more deftly than it had in this case? The broader industry faced its own crossroads. The regulatory precedent set by the deal's collapse meant that mega mergers in critical tech infrastructure would now be approached with extreme caution. This could slow consolidation and preserve a more distributed competitive landscape, or, conversely, it could push companies toward quieter, less visible forms of control, like long-term licensing deals, minority investments, or strategic alliances that skirt formal merger definitions. Geopolitically, The case served as a preview of a more fragmented regulatory order where antitrust enforcement is interwoven with national security, industrial policy, and technological sovereignty. The coordinated resistance to the deal across the US, UK, EU, and China hinted at a rare moment of alignment, but also raised the possibility that future tech transactions could become proxy battlegrounds for larger political rivalries. Even the open-source movement found itself pulled into the wake of the collapse. RSK-5 advocates framed the outcome as proof that no single company should control the core architecture of modern computing, using the Nvidia ARM experience as a rallying cry for adoption. Whether this would translate into sustained market share gains remained to be seen, but the message resonated with governments and startups alike. In the end, the Nvidia ARM story didn't close with a clean resolution. It left a narrative gap, a sense that the forces shaping the industry were still in motion. The what-if scenarios remained potent. What if Nvidia had offered deeper structural remedies? What if geopolitical tensions had been lower? What if the deal had been announced in a different regulatory climate? These unanswered questions are precisely why the saga continues to echo through boardrooms and policy circles. For some, it's a cautionary tale of ambition colliding with reality. For others, it's proof that regulatory vigilance can keep technological choke points from forming. For everyone watching, it's a reminder that in the semiconductor industry, endings are rarely final. They are simply the start of the next chapter.